book that is a critic for the people that uses the lens of utilitarianism to interpret animal liberation. This book of Peter Singer's, but Peter Singer. But in fact, uh, Renzo Llorente tell us that the book is based on the principle of non maleficence. So he says that the most common error among professional philosophers no doubt consists in the belief that moral argument advanced by animal liberation is based on utilitarianism, or what in effect amounts to the same thing, the tendency to analyze the book as though its normative basis were utilitarian, when in reality the views defended in animal liberation are derived at bottom from the principle of non maleficence. So non-maleficence, it means not causing harm. And the other principle that he talks about is the principle equal consideration of interests, which means that the interests of ever being affected by an action are to be taken into account and given the same weight as the like interests of any other being. But he chooses mainly the principle of non-maleficence to build his arguments in the text, Renzo Llorente. At first, it is necessary to talk about the essential features of utilitarianism that Llorente show us in the text. As an ethical theory, utilitarianism, number one, is a consequentialist doctrine. What matters in the moral assessment of acts are the act's consequences. Two, holds that there is only one type of consequence that matters or counts. For example, pleasure, happiness, welfare, preference, satisfaction. It acknowledges one value or state as the sole intrinsic good. Three, includes a principle of maximization of the intrinsic good. And four, assumes that each person's happiness or pleasure, welfare, in a world, whichever intrinsic good is stipulated, is equally important or should be counted equally. So he, he says that even though sometimes Peter Singer shows that his personal view is utilitarian, but his book, Animal Liberation, is not utilitarian. Um, for example, the terms utilitarianism and utilitarian hardly ever appear in the pages of Animal Liberation, uh, according to Llorente. Moreover, when Singer does explicitly discuss his normative framework, he makes it clear that his argument proceeds from a certain conception of the principle of non maleficence. So Llorente puts this principle as his main lens to observe and to interpret animal liberation work. As he writes in the first chapter, the conclusions that are argued for in this book flow from the principle of minimizing suffering and love. So, this is the basis of the book. Singer has underscored on at least one occasion that text of animal liberation is not utilitarian. So, uh, Llorente underscores that the book is not utilitarian, even though sometimes Sanger uses utilitarian arguments to answer his criticisms, the critics that he receives. No doubt, one reason for the tendency to construe mistakenly animal liberation as a utilitarian argument has to do with the fact that Singer has stressed in countless writings that his own ethical position or outlook is purely utilitarian. Furthermore, Singer has taken pains to explain that he personally is a vegetarian on account of his utilitarianism. So sometimes in the text, Llorente says that it is a mistake that Singer make uh, when he starts to answer the critics that he received through utilitarian arguments, or as the critics were legitimate, but sometimes the critics are not legitimate because they assume, first, they assume that the text is utilitarian and it is not. Singer has on occasion favored this very mistake insofar as he has refrained from correcting those who, in the course of their direct exchange with him, have referred to animal liberation as utilitarian defense of animals, like I said. Um, Singer's formulation of some of animal liberation's central propositions actually tend to favor a utilitarian interpretation of his book. So sometimes his own words are against him because it may cause utilitarian interpretation of the book. On the one hand, in attempting to meet objections to various aspects of animal liberation, Singer has taken the trouble to respond to criticism that only makes sense on the assumption that the book is an exercise in utilitarian philosophy. On the other hand, he has himself resorted to utilitarian reasoning in his efforts to refute the various criticism leveled against animal liberation, as I have already said. So, using mainly the principle of non maleficence, Renzo Llorente will talk about five elements uh, of animal liberation, five questions. The first one is the use of violence to advance animal liberation. So, Peter Singer, basically in Animal Liberation, he shows that he's against the use of violence in order to search for an animal liberation. According to Peter Singer, violence can only breed more violence, a cliche, but one that can be seen to be tragically true in half of a dozen conflicts all around the world. So his rejection of violence, according to Llorente, does not prove speciesist either, for the principle of non maleficence entails the obligation not to cause harm without this being an absolute prohibition. Uh, so one can say that his rejection of violence is speciesist because, for example, you cannot use violence to help the mission of animal liberation, but instead it would be acceptable to use it against human beings, but it's not the message here. It seems clear, therefore, that utilitarians must never exclude the use of violence as a matter of principle. So Peter Singer is not does not use a utilitarian argument here because utilitarians should they want to maximize utility. They think that in order to save more life, for example, in order to save more lives of animals, they should use violence, but a certain amount of violence. So violence is acceptable according to, depending on the consequences, But animal liberation is not interpreted as a work of utilitarian applied ethics, according to Llorente. Um, the second question about uh, animal liberation is about replaceability. So, uh, a number of animals, like 10 animals, can live a very good life, comfortable, happy, um, but with a humane form of killing for in order to eat or other things, and after they will be replaced by other 10 animals that will live comfortably and happy and other things. So the utility will continue the same. That's the utilitarian argument. But here, Peter Singer show us that this is not the only thing that he's thinking about. Okay, we can question the meat produced, according to Peter Singer, the meat produced in such a humane fashion makes up a very small part of the total quantity consumed in industrial societies. So, can we really deny that to bring into the world a being who will have a pleasant life is to confer on that being a benefit? The argument we are now considering raises the issue of the wrongness of killing. So here we are not talking about only about the amount of utility or other things. We are talking about life itself. He's questioning, and Llorente says that he has not really, Peter Singer has not yet really an answer about this, but he considers the wrongness of killing itself. The principle of non maleficence, on the other hand, serves to ground the condemnation of killing animals for food in most circumstances, for the simple reason that to end an animal's life will be, generally speaking, to cause it harm. So, Llorente considers that many of the arguments that Peter Singers used to respond the criticisms are not necessary because it you can answer faster and simply with the principle of non maleficence, because the principle of non maleficence itself has the answer for the questions that one can put it. Uh, the other question that Llorente analyzes is the ethical justification for vegetarianism. Peter Singer, personally, he defends vegetarianism as because of his utilitarian vision of the world. But the book is not has not the view the his personal view. He constructs arguments that go beyond his own personal view. Furthermore, Singer maintains that becoming a vegetarian is not merely a symbolic gesture, but rather is a highly practical and effective step. Since vegetarianism is a form of boycott, one may interpret it as uh, utilitarian, but if you following, it turns out, nevertheless, that it is not necessary to invoke such arguments. When we talk about that, Llorente is referring to some arguments that Singer uses to refute his detractor, like we talk, can we say like that? Um, Only using for the principle of non-maleficence, we have the answers. Um, we're here talking about moral vegetarianism. Uh, the commitment with no, with the moral vegetarianism can be derived directly from the principle of non maleficence. By adopting vegetarianism, we largely succeed in discharging our obligation to animals not to cause them unnecessary suffering. So we can defend this view that the book uh, defends vegetarianism through non-maleficence principle instead of seeing it as utilitarian. Until now, we see that uh, Llorente stressed that Singer uses this principle of non maleficence. So, if one starts to read or analyze animal liberation uh, through thinking before that it is already it is utilitarian, so the person will interpret the whole book as uh, utilitarian. So uh, Llorente explains to us that we can better interpret animal liberation by using the principle of non maleficence, uh, as we have said before. The other question, the fourth question, the advisability of human interventions in nature to prevent the harms that some animals inflict upon others. This is uh, another question that he poses about uh, if humans should minimize the suffering of animals in the nature. Uh, Singer says that we should not do that. So one can think about an utilitarian argument to defend this idea by saying that if human beings started um intervening in the nature in order to avoid and minimizing suffering of other animals, the results would be more harmful. So according to if we use a utilitarian interpretation, but Llorente and Peter Singer's Llorente says, and following that he makes a citation. If we proceed from the principle of non-maleficence, we need not trouble ourselves with these sorts of deliberations, nor must it be admitted that the existence of carnivorous animals does pose a problem for ethics of animal liberation. So, if we use the principle of non-maleficence, it is easier to analyze this controversy uh, and to understand that it's not a problem of ethics for us what happens in nature. 5, the last example that Llorente shows us. At any rate, if the principle that orients and regulates our treatment of animals is not do not cause harm, and we have not assumed any duty to maximize the good, however it is defined, we can, without any risk of contradiction, categorically condemn speciesism. As I have already said, some people consider that some views of uh, Peter Singer, especially his view about being against violence. It could be speciesism because with human beings, people can use violence to protect other human beings, but with animals, not, or other things like that. Um, so if you consider this topic about speciesism, if you consider this topic through the view of non-maleficence, we can arrive to this conclusion that one can categorically condemn speciesism, defending that we should not use violence. Even if a situation arises in which a speciesist act would serve to maximize the good, the fact that it would also cause harm would be sufficient grounds for the agent to refrain from performing the act. So here is a choice of a person that can uh, think before everything, above all, can think about non-maleficence instead of a utilitarian decision. So you can not, you choose not to perform the act because you know that it will cause harm. So after all, Llorente proposes us to analyze and to read and to think um, animal liberation through the view of the principle of non-maleficence instead of interpreting that the book is utilitarian. It is possible that a book is built with other ideas that go beyond utilitarian, personal utilitarian view of life or something like that. Once it is understood that many of the most frequent and supposedly devastating philosophical criticism of Singer's book are in fact quite groundless, it becomes much easier to understand why, more than 3 decades after it was first published, animal liberation remains such an enduring contribution to applied ethics. So sometimes Peter Singer does not know how to answer properly the criticism, so that's why some people continue to believe that the book is utilitarian. That's why Llorente's text is very helpful to interpret this book and to understand it differently. So, thank you very much. That's it.
Parabéns, Caroline, muito bom.
Obrigada.
Vamos começar o debate agora. Eu vou parar a transmissão